So today I'll be filming a video on who I think the 32 players will be uh, that are picked in the NFL draft's first round, which is this Thursday. That starts at 7 p.m. Central Time. And I couldn't rank the players from 1 to 32 because I don't know enough about the NFL to do that. I barely watch the NFL, so I don't know who uh, each team is needing. Uh, so I decided to rank the players uh, going by position and how I think they should go, not really how I think they will go. So in quarterbacks. I do think that Caleb Williams will not just be the first quarterback taken, but he'll be the first player taken. And Chicago gets the number one pick this time in the draft, so I think he'll play for Chicago. Uh, and of course, in 2022, uh, he was no doubt the best quarterback in the country. Having a, a 4,537 uh, passing yards and a 66.6 completion percentage and 42 touchdown passes and uh, averaging 9.1 yards per throw uh, and an amazing 30 or 324 passing yards per game. All of those numbers were really good. And then I know in 2023 he didn't even get to be a finalist for the Heisman Trophy, but I still think he was the best quarterback in the country because if you watched USC play last year, you know that they had a horrible offensive line, one of the worst in the country that couldn't protect him. And there were so many times last year where uh, he was getting pressured, and it looked like he was going to get sacked or at least have to throw it away. And he would find a receiver to make a big play. And just no other quarterback, I don't think, can do it uh, quite like he can. And last season, in 12 games, he still had over 300 yards passing a game, 3,633 yards. And his completion percentage actually went up 2% to 68.6%. And he did have 30 touchdown passes, and his yards per throw average went up to 9.4. He's going to be great, I think, in the NFL and have a long uh, career there. And he can also run some too. He's not a great runner, but he has done it when he's needed to. Uh, and Jaden Daniels, I have going number two. Uh, Washington gets the number two pick in the draft, so I think that's where he'll play. And I've got him at two because of how good of a runner he is. And that's why I think he won the Heisman last year, is because of how good of a runner he is. And he's a really good thrower, too, but uh, he averaged nearly 95 rushing yards per game last year at LSU, and he had 3,812 passing yards per game, or not per game, but in the season at LSU last year, which is well over 300 yards per game. He played in 12 games, and he had 11.7 yards per throw average, which that is so good. And he also had uh, mm, 40 touchdown passes and 10 rushing touchdowns, so 50 total touchdowns last season. And uh, he had a 72.2 completion percentage. He's a very accurate passer. And he had 1,134 rushing yards last season. He really pretty much put the LSU football team on his back and carried them to a 9-win season. Uh, and uh, mm, I know quarterbacks don't run a lot in the NFL usually, but there are a few that do, uh, like Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. And I think now the NFL is going to have another one like that with Jaden Daniels. And then number three is Bo Nix from Oregon. So he really only became an elite passer when he got to Oregon these past 2 seasons. Before that, he played at Auburn. He wasn't that good of a thrower, and I have him ahead of Michael Penix because Bo Nix can run around some when he needs to, and Michael Penix can't really run. And I've also noticed from watching a lot of Washington games last season that Penix isn't very good when pressured, like Caleb Williams is. And there probably is going to be a lot of that in the NFL. And that's why I've got Bo Nix ahead of him, even though uh, uh, Washington beat Oregon 3 times in the last 2 years. Bo Nix, in his first year at Oregon, had 3,593 passing yards and 29 touchdown passes on an 8.8 uh, yards per throw average and 71.9 completion percentage. And then he got even better in year two. In year two, he had 4,508 passing yards and a 9.6 yards completion uh, uh, per completion, uh, and 45 touchdown passes. So that's a big increase. And he increased his completion percentage to 77.4%. That almost never happens. I don't think I've ever seen a quarterback until him complete the uh, mm, even 75% of their passes. And Penix at Washington the last 2 seasons has had uh, uh, more than a total of 9,500 passing yards, which is a whole lot. Uh, in 2022, he had 4,641 passing yards and 31 touchdown passes and 8.4 yards per throw and 65.3% completion percentage. And then in 2023, uh, his yards was 4,903, and he did though play 2 more games, so that went down a little bit. But he had 36 touchdown passes, and then his average yards per throw went up last year to 8.8, and his completion percentage stayed around the same. Uh, and then number five, Drake May from North Carolina. In 2022, he had a huge year. He had 4,321 passing yards and 698 rushing yards, and he had 8.4 yards per throw and 66.2 completion percentage, and he threw 38 touchdown passes and also had 7 rushing touchdowns. He can throw and run around really well. Uh, so I think he'll be good in the pro. Uh, and then his numbers went down a little bit in his second and final year as North Carolina's starting quarterback. Mm, in that year, he had 3,608 passing yards per game in 12 games, so he still had over 300 passing yards per game, and his completion percentage went down to 63.3, and his yards per throw stayed around the same, and uh, his touchdowns went way down to 24 passing touchdowns, and he did have 9 rushing touchdowns though, and uh, 449 rushing yards. Mm, uh, so his rushing yardage went down a little bit too, but that partly was because he played a few less games in 23 than he did in 22. Uh, mm, and then number 6, J.J. McCarthy from Michigan. So I wouldn't really have thought that McCarthy would go first round, but I've been seeing on the internet that he probably will, so I put him on here. I know Michigan won the championship last year, but he didn't have as much to do with it being the quarterback as you might think he would have. Michigan uh, did it mainly because of their elite defense and great run game. He was more of a game manager type of quarterback, and he did a good job at that. But he didn't have huge numbers. He averaged just under 200 passing yards per game last season, and he did have 9 yards per throw average though, which is uh, good. Uh, and he had uh, 22 passing touchdowns, and he had a 72.3 completion percentage, which that is really good. He did improve in his second year as Michigan's starting quarterback, because in his first year, his uh, average was 8.4, and uh, his completion percentage was at 64.6. So a team that's kind of looking more for like a game manager quarterback, I think would probably want to take him. Uh, and wide receivers. I did watch a few Dallas games last season, and their best receiver is C.D. Lamb, and he's really good, one of the best in the pro. But I noticed they don't really have any other good receivers to help him out, so I wouldn't be shocked if Dallas takes a receiver in the first round. Uh, mm, and Marvin Harrison will be a top 5 pick for sure. From Ohio State. He's been the best receiver in America the past 2 seasons at Ohio State. In 22, in 13 games, he had 77 catches for 1,263 yards and 14 touchdowns and a 16.4 yards per catch average, which is really good. And then he got even better in his second year as a starting wide receiver. Uh, he had in 12 games at 67 catches for 1,211 yards, and uh, he improved to 18.1 yards per catch, which that is so good. And he still had 14 touchdowns. So in his time at Ohio State, he had nearly 2,500 receiving yards in 2 seasons, and he had 1,500 or more yard receiving games. Marvin Harrison is the type of wide receiver that for NFL defenses, they'll just have to make sure to keep the ball away from him or double cover him because you're not going to win one-on-one coverages against Marvin Harrison. And then number 2, Roma Dunze from Washington. Uh, mm, so uh, he had 2 really good seasons at Washington. In 2022, he had 75 catches for 1,145 yards and 7 touchdowns and a 15.3 yards per catch average. And then he improved on that in 2023. to become the second best receiver in America with 92 catches and 1,640 yards and 13 touchdowns and uh, 17.8 yards per catch. And he averaged 109 receiving yards a game. That is like unbelievably good. Uh, and Malik Neighbors is number 3 from LSU. Uh, so uh, Neighbors in 2022 had a really good year with 72 catches for 1,017 yards and a 14.1 yards per catch average, and he had 3 receiving touchdowns, and he improved on that in 2023 uh, to 89 catches and 1,569 receiving yards and 14 touchdowns and a 17.6 yards per catch average. And then number 4, Troy Franklin from Oregon. Uh, so in 2022, he had 61 catches for 891 yards and a 14.6 yards per catch average and 9 receiving touchdowns. And then he improved on that in 2023 to become one of the best receivers with 81 catches for 1,383 yards and 14 receiving touchdowns on a 17.1 yards per catch average. And then number 5, Brian Thomas from LSU. So Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas were the two best wide receivers combined in the country last year. Brian Thomas had a good enough year last year to where I think he will probably get picked somewhere in the 20s of the first round of the NFL draft. He had in 2023 68 catches for 1,177 receiving yards and 17.3 yards per catch, and he had a, a, a high of 17 receiving touchdowns, uh, which was the most in the country uh, last season. And Adunse and Neighbors, I think, will probably both go in the top 10 somewhere. Uh, so now I'll move on to running backs. So I'm not so sure that there'll be a running back taken in the first round this time. But if there is one, it'll be Blake Corum, I think. He might get uh, in the 30s of the first round, maybe even number 32. But I also think there's a good chance that he might only be an early second round pick. Uh, uh, but Blake Corum in 2022 in 11 games as the starter had 1,457 rushing yards and 18 touchdowns and 5.9 yards per carry on 245 carries. And then in 2023, he had 258 carries and started all 15 games. And his yards did go down to 1,245, and his yards per carry went down 2 to 4.8. Uh, but he was a touchdown machine last year with 27 rushing touchdowns. And even in 2021, as the number 2 running back on Michigan's team, he had nearly 1,000 rushing yards. And tight ends, the only one I see being in the first round is Brock Bowers from Georgia. I think he'll go in the top 10. He's been the best tight end in the country the past 2 seasons. He is like a wide receiver. He makes as many catches as the good wide receivers do, and he's as fast as a wide receiver. tight ends that usually aren't that fast, but he is. In 2022, he had 63 catches for 942 yards and 7 touchdowns and averaged 15 yards per catch, which that's really good for a tight end in 15 games. And then in 2023, he was injured for some of the season and only played in 10 games, but he improved as a player, I think, with in that uh, 10 games, 56 catches for 714 yards and 6 touchdowns. And his average did go down to 12.8 yards per catch, though. But Bowers is going to have a good long career in the NFL. Uh, and tight ends are very useful in the pro too, with how good the defenses are. Uh, mm, so now I'll move on to offensive linemen. So I think that J.C. Latham is the best offensive lineman in the draft, but I'm not so sure that he'll be the first one taken. But I think he'll probably be a first round pick. Uh, mm, so in his time at Alabama, he was the starter for 2 seasons uh, mm, on uh, part of the offensive line. And in his first season as the starter, he never allowed any sacks and allowed only 12 pressures. And then in uh, mm, uh, his second year as the starter, he allowed 2 sacks and only 14 pressures, but that was in one more game than in 2022. And then number two, Olu Fashanoa from Penn State. Uh, mm, so mm, he started 21 games in his college career and never allowed any sacks and only allowed 10 pressures. And 6 of those came in one game, I saw. So that's very impressive. Mm, and at number three, Joe Alt from Notre Dame. Uh, so he started 33 games in his college career and only allowed 4 sacks and 24 pressures in that time. And 11 of those pressures that he allowed and 3 of the sacks that he allowed in his college career came in his first season. So he became a very elite offensive lineman. And then four, Amarius Mims from Georgia. Uh, so he only started 7 games in his college career, but he was a 5-star recruit, the number one recruit from the state of Georgia. And in his career, he did play for 3 seasons and never allowed any sacks and only allowed 6 pressures. And at five, Troy Fatana from Washington. So Washington won the award for the best offensive line last season, and he was the best offensive lineman on that offensive line. So that should tell you how good he is. And at Washington, he started 2 seasons in a row, 28 games, and only allowed 27 pressures and just 2 sacks during that time. Uh, and then number six, Jackson Johnson from Oregon. So he was called the best center in the country last season. And he only started 14 games in his college career, but played in 3 seasons and never allowed any sacks and only allowed 4 pressures in his college career. And then number seven, Tally's Fuga from Oregon State. Uh, and he in his 3 years at Oregon State, he only allowed 23 pressures and never allowed 1 sack, which that's very good. he started 12 games for them last season. Uh, and then at number 8, Tyler Guyton from Oklahoma. So in his college career and almost 1,000 snaps on the offensive line, he only allowed 2 sacks and 16 pressures, and he never allowed any sacks in 2023. And then defensive linemen, uh, I have Jared Verse from Florida State being number 1. So in 2022, he started 9 games and played in 12 and had 48 tackles, 9 sacks, and uh, 3 pass rushes, and a forced fumble. Uh, and that's very good for a defensive lineman to have 48 tackles and 9 sacks like that in a season. And then in 23, he started 13 games and had 41 tackles for 9 more sacks. And then he had 11 pass rushes, and then 3 pass breakups. And then number 2, Leitua Lotta from UCLA. So last season at UCLA, uh, mm, I said in the last video that they had an improved defense, and he was the best player on that defense with 49 tackles, and he had 13 sacks, which that's a whole lot of sacks for a season, and 2 forced fumbles and 2 interceptions, and he had 21.5 tackles for loss, which was the most in the country last season. Uh, and then number 3, Johnny Newton from Illinois. Uh, mm, so in 2021, he had 50 tackles and 3.5 sacks, and 22, he improved to 59 tackles and 5.5 sacks, and 2 fumble recoveries, and 3 pass breakups, and 11 pass rushes. And in 23, he had 52 tackles and 7.5 sacks and a fumble recovery, and 2 pass breakups, and 9 pass rushes. Very good. And then number 4, Braden Fiskey from Florida State. So last season he was a starter for them in 13 games and had 43 tackles and 6 sacks and 5 pass rushes, and he had a really good game in the ACC championship with 9 tackles and 3 sacks. And then 5, Byron Murphy from Texas. So last season he started all 14 games and had 29 tackles and 5 sacks, and he had 7 pass rushes. And then at number 6, Chop Robinson from Penn State. Uh, so he played in all 12 games in 2022 and had 26 tackles and 5.5 sacks and 3 pass rushes and 2 pass breakups and a fumble recovery. And then in 23, he had 10 starts. Uh, mm, and in those 10 starts, he had 15 tackles and uh, mm, uh, uh, 4 sacks and 2 forced fumbles and 5 pass rushes. Mm, so now cornerbacks. So Carryon Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry were the top 2 cornerbacks in the country last season, and it was amazing that they were on the same team. So Arnold is more of a tackler than McKinstry is, but McKinstry is a better cornerback in coverage, I think, than Arnold is. So Carryon Arnold last season had 63 tackles and 12 pass breakups and 5 interceptions, which it was an improvement from what he had the year before, 45 tackles and 8 pass breakups and 1 interception. Uh, and McKinstry uh, in 3 seasons at Alabama had 93 total tackles and 23 pass breakups and uh, 2 interceptions, and 15 of those pass breakups came in 2022. Uh, and number 3, Cooper DeJean from Iowa. So in 2022, he had 75 tackles and 5 interceptions and 8 pass breakups and 3 pick sixes. That's rare to have 3 pick sixes in a season. Uh, and then in 2023, he played in 10 games. And in 22, he played in every game. But in 23, he had 41 tackles and 2 interceptions and 5 pass breakups. And then uh, Nate Wiggins from Clemson in 2022 had uh, 30 tackles and an interception and a pick six and 11 pass breakups. That's a lot for a season. And then in 23, he had 28 tackles and uh, mm, 2 forced fumbles and a sack and 2 interceptions and another pick six and 6 pass breakups. And uh, mm, in 23, he played in 12 games, and in 22, he played in 14 games. And then linebackers, the only one I seen going first round is Dallas Turner from Alabama, a really good linebacker that was a 5-star recruit. And he had at Alabama. In 2021, he only started 3 games, but had 30 tackles and 8.5 sacks and 5 pass rushes and a fumble recovery. And uh, in 2022, he became a starter and had 37 tackles and 4 sacks and 9 pass rushes and a fumble recovery for a touchdown. He had 10 starts in 2022, but then in 2023 he had his best year of all, where he started all 14 games and had 53 tackles and 10 sacks and uh, 13 pass rushes and 2 forced fumbles and 1 pass breakup. He's not just a great linebacker, but he can also be a great pass rusher too. He'll be one of the best players in the NFL, I think. So uh, uh, that will be it with this video, and please subscribe and thanks for watching, and I'll be back very soon.